Your alarm goes off at 6:45, and before your eyes are even open, your brain is already running the math on the day, the meeting, the commute, whether there's time for coffee. By 5, if you're lucky, you're clocked out. Except you're not, because your phone follows you home, buzzing on the nightstand like it has never once considered that the day might be over. For almost the entire time humans have existed, none of that happened. No alarm, no commute, no clock to punch, because there was no clock, and no job to have, because the job hadn't been invented yet. For roughly 300,000 years, your ancestors lived without any of it, and worked less than you do this week. So what were they doing with the rest of their time? One researcher who lived over a year with a hunting band in the Kalahari came back with an answer nobody expected: a lot of napping. That's not the strange part. The strange part is what happens next, because somewhere between that campsite and your inbox, something made humans start working more, not less. Figuring out what that was might explain why you never quite feel like you have enough time, even now. In the 1960s, an anthropologist named Richard Lee moved in with a group of Juhowansi hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari Desert and did something almost nobody had done before. He timed them. Every trip to gather mongongo nuts, every hunt, every hour, actually spent producing food, logged and counted like a timesheet. What he found became one of the most cited numbers in anthropology. Adults were spending somewhere around 15 to 20 hours a week on the work of staying alive. Not 8 hours a day, 15 hours a week. That leaves a lot of hours left over. Lee didn't find people using them to build empires or invent the wheel out of boredom. He found people resting, talking, visiting other camps, telling long stories nobody was in a hurry to finish. A full-time job, by comparison, runs around 40 hours of paid work. Before you add the commute, the emails answered at 10 at night, the mental leftovers of the day that don't clock out even when you do. Later researchers have argued Lee's count left out some of the cooking, childcare, and tool repair that also kept people busy. But even the more generous reanalyses still land well under a modern workweek, not anywhere close to over it. Nobody in that Kalahari camp was checking a group chat at 11 p.m. There was no group chat. There was, apparently, a lot of free time, and not much interest in filling it with anything resembling a job. Here's the question that should be sitting in the back of your mind right now. If this was the normal human condition for that long, why did anyone ever agree to work more? Somewhere along the way, we traded a 15-hour week for a 40-hour one, and it wasn't because the 40-hour version paid better in nutrition or in years lived. When an anthropologist named Marshall Solins looked at data like Lee's, he made an argument that upended how anthropologists thought about early humans. He presented it at a landmark 1966 conference, fittingly titled Man the Hunter, and called hunter-gatherers the original affluent society. Not because they had a lot of stuff, but because they wanted very little, and what they wanted, the land mostly provided, without a 40-hour negotiation attached to it. Affluence, in his framing, was never about how much you had. It was about how small the gap was between what you wanted and what you already had. And by that measure, a hunter-gatherer with almost nothing could be wealthier than someone with a closet full of things they never have time to use. Here's where it gets interesting. If that's true, something must have happened to close that easy relationship between want and get. And it did, somewhere around 10 to 12,000 years ago, in the shift historians call the agricultural revolution. The moment, more and more researchers now argue, when we quietly signed up for more work, not less. For a long time, the assumption was simple. Farming was progress. Planting your own food instead of chasing it should have meant more security, more free time, more comfort. That's the story most of us were taught, in one form or another, and it feels obvious enough that almost nobody stopped to check it. Then archaeologists actually checked the skeletons. Early farmers, compared to the foragers who came before them, were shorter. Their bones show more evidence of malnutrition, more childhood stress, more chronic disease, more of the tiny growth defects in tooth enamel that show up when a body goes hungry young. A single crop failure could now mean starvation, in a way a forager moving between dozens of wild food sources rarely faced. And the workload, measured by the best estimates researchers can reconstruct, went up, not down. Guarding a field, tending a harvest, storing and defending grain that could rot, get stolen, or fail outright. That turned out to be a far more demanding way to survive than 15 hours a week around a campfire. Progress, it turns out, was the thing that made humans work harder, not the thing that let them work less. There's a piece of this story most people have never heard, and it's the piece that actually explains your Tuesday. Grain can be stored. Meat, mostly, cannot. And the moment a society has a pile of something valuable sitting in one place, it needs someone to grow it, someone to guard it, and, eventually, someone to own it. That's the moment ownership, as you understand it, really starts to take hold. Not with money, with a granary. Some of the earliest walled settlements archaeologists have ever excavated weren't built to keep out armies. They were built around a grain store worth protecting. Once surplus exists, some people end up controlling more of it than others, and the people who control it don't have to work quite as hard as the people who don't. Some historians even trace the earliest writing systems back to this exact problem. Someone needed a reliable way to record whose grain was whose, long before anyone used writing to tell a story. Hierarchy shows up. Then specialization shows up, because not everyone needs to farm if someone else is farming enough for 2 families. A potter can just make pots, a builder can just build, as long as somebody's surplus grain is quietly paying for the arrangement. Give humans a surplus of grain, and apparently middle management shows up within a generation. Then, much later, wages show up, because it turns out it's easier to manage 100 workers with a payment than with a spear. If you had to draw the job, as a character in this story, it wouldn't show up for a very long time. It doesn't arrive with fire. It doesn't arrive with language, or art, or the wheel. It arrives quietly, centuries after the first granary, the first time somebody needs to pay a stranger to guard grain that isn't theirs. By the time you get to a factory floor in the 1800s, the 15-hour week Richard Lee documented isn't even a memory. It has been replaced, gradually, by a system built entirely around the idea that a human life's value can be measured in hours sold. Here's the part that should really bother you. You might assume all that modern comfort at least bought back some physical ease, that whatever was lost in leisure was gained in not having to work the body quite as hard. A researcher named Herman Ponzer strapped tracking devices onto modern Hadza hunter-gatherers in Tanzania and used a technique that measures energy expenditure down to the calorie, tracking exactly how much fuel they burned in a day of foraging, walking, digging, and carrying. The number came back almost identical to the energy a sedentary office worker burns sitting at a desk in an air-conditioned building all day. Same fuel spent, wildly different life to show for it. It suggested something researchers hadn't expected going in. A body built for a physically demanding, foraging life may simply cap out at a certain daily energy budget no matter how the hours around it get spent. Nobody was measuring calories in the Kalahari either, for the record. They were too busy resting. It isn't just ancient history. Decades after Lee's original count, another researcher, James Sussman, returned to some of those same Juhuansi communities as they were pulled, often against their own preference, into wage economies and government settlements. What struck him wasn't how eagerly people adopted the 40-hour structure. It was how reluctantly. An older instinct about time, that it belongs to you until something urgent says otherwise, doesn't disappear just because a paycheck shows up. Some of the people he spoke with treated a fixed daily shift the way you might treat a cage, not a convenience. He noted something else, too, given the choice. Some who could still forage often did, even when wage work paid more per hour. Because more hours strapped to somebody else's schedule for a little extra money didn't look like a good trade to someone whose ancestors had never had to make it. Here's the thing. Almost nobody realizes about the 40-hour week. Specifically, it isn't ancient, it isn't natural, and it isn't even old. It's barely a century old. Factory shifts in the early Industrial Revolution regularly ran 12, 14, 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, for adults and children alike. Worse, in raw hours, than anything Richard Lee ever recorded in the Kalahari. The 8-hour day, the 2-day weekend, the 40-hour structure your entire life is quietly built around, only became standard law in the United States in 1938. If the full span of human existence were compressed into a single 24-hour day, the 40-hour workweek wouldn't appear until the last few seconds before midnight. You are living inside an invention younger than your own grandparents, and treating it like a law of nature. And it doesn't even stop at 40 hours anymore. Some surveys now put the average adult's daily phone screen time north of 4 hours, layered on top of the workday, not instead of it. 15 hours a week around a campfire has quietly become something closer to 70, once you count the parts of your evening that still technically belong to work. Which brings this back to 6:45 this morning, and the meeting math running in your head before your eyes were even open. That instinct, the sense that your time belongs to a schedule, that rest has to be earned, that being unproductive for an afternoon should feel a little bit like guilt. None of it came from your biology. Your ancestors didn't evolve to need a job. They evolved around a campfire with 15 free hours a week and nowhere urgent to be. Somewhere between that campfire and your inbox, something got sold to us as normal that never actually was. And every time your phone lights up after 5 o'clock, some very old part of you, the part that spent 300,000 years knowing exactly when the workday ended, still doesn't understand why it hasn't.